Okay, so hello everybody. I'm Professor Huhtamo from the Department of Design Media Arts here at UCLA, and I would like to welcome you to the fourth in the series of our theory lecture series. And it's my great pleasure to introduce you Lev Manovich, our speaker today. So Lev Manovich is a very well-known media theorist and also an artist. He's at the moment he's a professor at UCSD at the art department, and there he's also director of the Software Studies Initiative at the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology, which is known as CalIT2, and he's also a visiting researcher at Godsmith College in London and College of Fine Arts at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. So I'll just say a few words about Lev's many works. He's extremely well known all around the world for his book, Languages of New Media, which was published in 2001 and has been translated to many languages all around the world, and I think has also become an important generator for discourse on this field. And in addition to that, I would like to mention a work called Soft Cinema, Navigating the Database, which I think sort of like represents this Lev's other side as an artist dealing with new media, which has been published as an edition from the MIT Press as a DVD, but has also been shown as an installation work in many places, including London, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and many other prestigious institutions. Lev has also published a book called Black Box, White Cube, which was published by the Merve Verlag in Berlin, which is a collection of essays, and I guess he's working on a new book that perhaps I don't know, maybe we hear something about. And it's been said about Lev that he's the most suggestive and broad-ranging media. So the writer of the most suggestive and broad-ranging media history since Marshall McLuhan. So with this, so please help me welcome Lev Manovich.
Okay, good afternoon. Is this working well? So, not working well. Is this good? Okay. So I haven't spoken to actually this new space after it was renovated, so it's a new experience. Looks very nice. And in discussing my lecture, it was sort of suggested to me that what I should do is give a kind of broad overview of my current and future projects. And I was trying to figure out how I would do it. When I realized that unfortunately I can't do it, and it's for the same reason why I never write like short art forum length, reviews of artists' work. It seems like my brain is impossible. My brain can't write anything without making some kind of argument, right? So I said if I simply talk about different books and different projects without making some argument, it's not going to work. So what I'm going to do instead, right, is slightly bend the genre, and in fact take you through a kind of background and talk about a very broad new research paradigm, which I'm just getting started on, and which I anticipate is going to occupy me for the rest of my life. And I think as a part of this conversation, I'm also going to address a question, like what is going to happen, or what does it mean to do theory in 21st century, right? Because of many important developments, such as the exponential increase in scale of a number of cultural producers, cultural objects, and cultural globalization, perhaps our 20th century concept of theory and history and criticism have to change as well. But before we go over, just very briefly, an overview, like a 2-minute overview of my 3 new books, which are in the process of sort of coming out. So the first book is called Expanded Image, and that's a homage to Gene Youngblood's famous book, Expanded Cinema. And this book, I'm talking about, it's a new dimensions of visual culture, visual communication, new uses and functions of images from, let's say, mid-90s until now, which haven't been yet addressed by, which largely have not been addressed yet by cultural critics, right? So even today, you still have all these discussions about digital photography, which was a kind of hot topic in '92, but maybe not as important in 2008, because in fact, we have a new topic, which is computational photography, right? So if you go to Wikipedia, there's a whole article on computational photography. So in this book, I'm trying to talk about a number of these dimensions, which I'm sure are familiar to everybody in this room, such as metadata, information visualization, and so on, right? So new dimensions of visual communications, new ways in which images are understood, and very new functions because of a kind of expanding sort of interactions between the visual sphere and information technology. Now, so I'm going up, down. Now, the number 2 book, right, is here. So this is one which basically I started working on in 2000 after I finished Language of New Media. And then as I was working on this book, it basically was kept getting longer and longer and longer. And then 2 years ago, I realized that it's actually 3 books, right? So that's how it happened. So the book is called Infoaesthetics, Information and Form. And it's kind of my attempt in this decade to go beyond, let's say, more narrow definition or more narrow understanding of what new media is, which was appropriate for the 90s, and to look at as many different cultural areas as I can, but not just any cultural areas, but basically areas where the interaction between, let's say, this cultural area, this cultural discourse, and the work which is already going on, and computers has been producing lots of interesting energy, right? So certain areas of fashion, graphic design, product design, web design, information visualization, architecture, including also new media art, and even sometimes contemporary art. And the way I organize my investigation is with a very basic question, right? Which is, the unprecedented growth of information puts new pressures on contemporary societies. Right? In fact, this is maybe one of the key pressures today on our society and culture. We need to invent new ways to interact with information, new ways to represent it, and new ways to make sense of it. Right? So my question is, my conceptual lens for which I look at kind of contemporary global culture or cultures, how do artists, designers, architects, filmmakers, fashion designers, right? How do cultural producers are dealing with this new priority, right? And what are the interesting projects and concepts and artistic concepts which are emerging, right, as a result of people trying to address this question. So how do artists, designers, and architects are responding to these challenges, right? And I'm also saying in this book that rather than trying to define ourselves against information glut, we try to defend ourselves against information bomb, which is the title of a very perceptive book by Paul Virilio, a French philosopher from 1996, right? Let's think of this new challenge, right, as a potential kind of creative catalyst, right? So how can we approach this new situation creatively as the opportunity to invent new forms, right, new aesthetic forms, new spatial forms, new interactive forms for our information-rich world. Okay, and then I was working with this, there's a third book which sort of came out from these investigations, and in this one I have already sort of submitted the manuscript to MIT, so it's now at the readers. So if things go well, it will come out, I don't know, either spring or fall of next year, and in the other 2 books, I would say. I have a new algorithm of how to finish books quickly. So I hope that I'll be able to finish Vava 2 actually probably in the next 10 to 12 months. Okay, so what this book is doing is kind of more of a historical, kind of conceptual history investigation, asking a different kind of question, right? So what were motivation of people, of key people in the research groups, which between 1960 and let's say, late 70s or 1980s have turned computer into what it is today, which is a cultural machine, right? A machine used to produce, access, share, remix, upload, download, aggregate culture. Because obviously the computers were not designed to do that, right? So it's development from Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad, right, all the way to Xerox Spark, and then the popularization of what these people have created in the 80s, right? So what was their thinking? Why did we do it? And then the second part of the book deals with kind of consequences, right? Consequences of the way these people have implemented the abilities to offer and interact and access media on the computers, right? Like the whole kind of shape of media offering and media access software, or what I would call cultural software, right? So what I'm arguing is because there are particular ways, very particular ways, because this generation of people have sort of imagined and implemented sort of media offering, interaction with media, graphical user interface, right? The whole kind of media layer of a modern computer, right? This then led to radical transformations in culture and in the very concepts of media, artwork and so on and so forth. So a big part of a second, so one of the chapters in this book, for example, looks at the whole field of motion graphics, which is, as you know, very important and very energetic cultural field, which so far has practically haven't been readdressed by any cultural critics as far as I know, even though this field is so huge and it's been around for, right, in its contemporary form since about 96, and looking at how, like, at the close connections between, let's say, the structure and properties of media offering software and the new aesthetics of the moving image. And then, let's say, another chapter looks at social media user-generated content, blogs, iGoogle, right, and the kind of whole media mobility and the way media operates on the web in this decade. Okay, so now that I mentioned the term software studies, let me kind of go, and this was a kind of introduction. Let me introduce now the software studies idea, and then we're actually going to go into the actual narrative of the talk. Okay. So, so around in 2003, me and one of the people who teaches in this department, Benjamin Breton, have been kind of having many conversations, and we wrote a proposal to MIT for a big, thick ZKM-style book with the title Software Society. And what we were thinking at the time, that while critics have seemingly addressed all the important aspects and dimensions of a digital revolution, right, and we now have a whole fields of internet studies or cyberspace studies or new media art and digital art, and the concept of network, which obviously has been very influential across the whole intellectual field. Paradoxically, the very engine, right, the very engine of IT revolution, the very engine on which modern society runs, right, the equivalent of what was the combustion engine and electricity for industrial society, right, this very foundation of sort of contemporary IT-based global post-1990 world, it's sort of, people only kind of touched upon it, but nobody put it, in the center, onto the stage. And what is it? It's software, right? So we said, we're not simply living in the information society, risk society, super modern society, and so on and so forth. Network society, right? Alia Manuel Castell's very influential count. We're also living in a software society, right? So our desire was not to create a new field of software studies, right, and not even necessarily establish it as a methodology, although my feeling it's probably going to become a field, it probably will become a methodology because this is how academia works. We simply wanted to sort of to talk to as many people as possible across, media theorists, social scientists, philosophers, and kind of take them by the collar and said, wait a second, whatever else you're writing about, somehow you should also count for the software. Okay, well, the book, we sort of didn't really, we might have said, okay, it's very nice, but, we don't have money to publish such a book with pictures, et cetera, et cetera. So then, 4 years later, in 2007, I convinced California Institute for Information and Telecommunication, which is one of the largest IT research institutes in this country, and it's between, you guys also have one of this institute between UCLA and Santa Barbara, but it's focused on sort of nano, and the institute, which is between Irvine and San Diego campuses, is focused on IT and telecommunication. So I convinced them to sort of give me some initial funding for a new center, a new lab, and after many conversations, we said, I said, like, the last thing I want to do is start another academic field, but as I go around, and talk to graduate students around the world, they come to me and they self-identify. Like a student would come to me in Amsterdam, or Singapore, and said, well, I'm doing software studies. Like, okay, well, I guess we have to serve as students now, right? So that's why we called our initiative Software Studies, okay? So this is an important part of my, let's say, intellectual and energy landscape, what I'm now involved. And in fact, in a few weeks, we're going to have the first North American workshop about this field. The first workshop was put by Matthew Fuller in 2006 when he was teaching in Rotterdam. He's now at Goldsmith. And the workshop is called Software, right? Software Studies Workshop. And unfortunately, we couldn't invite, everybody from design media departments and everybody from UCLA, but, Kate Hales and Casey Rees are coming, and we try to spread around our very limited funding. So what is software studies? Well, we're going to find out in a few weeks, right? Because all these people who are coming to our workshop, are going to tell us, right, what we think of software studies, right? So there are lots and lots of people coming. Okay. All right. So let's see, where is it? Yeah, so here are some of the people. Okay. And it was kind of amazing because we sent 15 invitations, and in the next 3 days, 14 people said, yes, we're coming, right? So we said, okay, I guess we're doing something right. But this is how I understand it, right? This is how I understand it. So for me, software studies is actually two things, okay? Let's see. Yeah. Right. Okay. So on the one hand, it's about bringing like humanities, kind of cultural criticism, and social science approach to talk about this new fundamental phenomena, which is central to modern kind of globalized world, which is the software, right? So how do we approach software layer, software dimension, right, of contemporary societies from perspectives of humanities, cultural criticism, social sciences? So that's one thing. But I'm equally interested in the reverse. That is, how can we start applying new software-based tools and methodologies, right, which are already used across modern sciences, governments, business, and other institutions? What if we start applying these tools and methodologies to the study of culture, right? So you see, software studies means two things. It's on the one hand, like looking at asking a question, what does it mean to live in software culture as opposed to pre-software culture? What does it mean to live in software society? Asking this question from a perspective of the tools, concepts, and methodologies in humanities and social sciences. On the other hand, to see what will happen if we kind of map the software-based tools, research paradigm, and methods as they already used in hard sciences, business, government, and so on. What if we map them onto the traditional theoretical questions, methodologies, in what we call theory, right? So it's also a way to reinvent theory for, let's say, the age of data mining, information visualization, Web 3.0, and so on and so forth. So this is what my talk is actually going to be about this second part. Okay. Okay. So prologue, 1905. A Russian avant-garde, actually symbolist poet, Andrei Belly, does a small study where he uses a new statistical method invented by a famous Russian mathematician Markov, who just invented this new method called Markov chains, to the study of rhythm and other structures in a small data set, what we would now call data set of Russian poetry. So as far as I know, it was the first application of mathematical tools, right, to try to look at the patterns in the, let's say, artistic work, like the kind of database of culture. Well, he doesn't follow up, but this is where it starts exactly 103 years ago. Then, of course, we go to other moments, right? If we follow this trajectory, Viktor Shklovsky, 1913, right? Russian formalism, right? The beginnings of modern 20th century theory to a certain extent, right? Some people would say we look at the specific artistic techniques and literature, photography, cinema, and other arts, and the study of evolution and development of these artistic techniques. Like what are these techniques which make art different from other types of discourses? Victor Prop, right? 1928, Morphology of Russian Folktale, right? A kind of proto-structuralist identification of basic narrative patterns in what we would now call the database, right, of Russian folktales, Roman Jakobson and so forth. Okay, so the reason I'm kind of putting this particular point on the map, if you think that Lev, why is he suddenly talking about all this stuff? Well, I think that there is something in the Russian cultural DNA, which somehow I got as well, about these ideas of, like, let's say, applying kind of, let's say, mathematical diagramming, a kind of approach to trying to map and understand the cultural patterns, right? Not just in a single work, but also across the body of work, right? So obviously there's a kind of long tradition of people doing it. Okay, jump number 2, 1945. As of course all of you know, Vannevar Bush publishes his now famous article, Is We May Think. And in this article, right, Bush talks about a kind of hypothetical machine, which later people identify as perhaps first conceptualization of hypertext or hypermedia. And what's interesting is that in the discussion of these articles, people usually don't really pay attention to why Bush wants to invent new machines, new technologies to help us think. Like, why? Well, let's look at the article, right? And as we know, of course, Bush was, right, basically coordinating, right, the war scientific effort, coordinating work of thousands of American scientists. So to a certain extent, he was the kind of father, right, of what we now call kind of industrial military scientific complex. And as somebody who was coordinating work of thousands of scientists, I think he became very familiar with the kind of limitations and how many scientists do research and what works and what doesn't work, right? He's observing all those people. And then after 1945, he published this article, right? And look what he's saying here, okay? There's a growing mountain of research, but there's increased evidence that they're being bogged down as specialization extends, right? Sorry. Okay, where is it? Okay, sorry, lost it. Okay. The investigator is staggered by the findings and conclusions of thousands of other workers, conclusions that he cannot find time to grasp, much less to remember as they appear. Right? Professionally, our methods of transmitting and reviewing the results of research are generations old and by now are totally inadequate for their purpose, okay? And so on and so forth. Okay. So it turns out that not only Bush, but let's say out of, let's say, 5 so-called, right, maybe key people who developed modern computing in the form which it now exists in the 60s, right, maybe not necessarily people who are coming more from art, like Alan Kay and Ted Nelson, but the other people, and maybe not necessarily Negroponte, although we have to look more closely, maybe Negroponte group as well, architecture machine group, but definitely both Licklider and Engelbart, right, coming from science, in fact, to a significant extent, we're preoccupied with the same problem. So what we can say is that one of the key forces, one of the key vectors, one of the key reasons behind the development of modern digital computer, not as a hardware, but in terms of various tools and techniques it provides to manage information and work with information media, was already existing realization as early as 1945 and definitely 50s and 60s of exponential growth of information, specifically scientific information. So now a modern computer is invented as a tool, right, to help people, specifically scientists, to deal with this information explosion, right? Now, of course, what we know is that this kind of invention had other, let's say, the effects which people didn't anticipate. Of course, as computers multiplied, as computers were connected to various sensors, right? Particle accelerators, sensor networks, other scientific instruments, and so on and so forth. Instead of solving the problem, right, we created more of a problem, right? We led to more information explosion. This is a kind of paradox of computer history. Well, by the way, a little footnote, I don't think we need less information. No, we need more information. We don't have enough, right? So I think definitely one of our jobs as a kind of cultural creators and artists to create more relevant information, right? For example, as I drive around Los Angeles, I feel a particular, right, Southern California, mid-20th century alienation because I'm in this highway city and there are these endless buildings around me. I would like to know what companies are inside the buildings, right? What was there before, what was replaced. I want to have a kind of Norman Klein voice, right? A kind of on my mobile phone, giving me a whole kind of tour, right? Talking about different layers. I want to see patterns of immigration, our demographics, right? Or for example, as I go into a conference, I want my PDA or computer or laptop, immediately kind of data mine everybody around me and see, okay, here's your friend, here's a person you really would like to meet because of your joint interests, right? So I don't think we need less information. I think we need more, but maybe different kind of information, right? So let's explode more information bombs, right? Okay, so this is just a little footnote. Okay, meanwhile, okay, well, it's good to dream about these things, but meanwhile, the amount of scientific research in particular multiplies, and the amount of data generated by scientists and scientific experiments, right, is getting bigger. So in 1998, exactly 30 years ago, encouraged by a group of scientists, including Larry Smarr, who is now director of Kalati 2, right, where I have my software studies lab, basically through funding, establish a whole new field of visualization, and SF specifically says we want to establish this new field as a way, as another attempt, right, to use computers to help scientists to deal with information growth. So now we're going to have computer techniques which will to take large amounts of unstructured data, turn it into analog images, right, spaces, or audio sequences, and we're going to use, let's say, if you believe in evolution, right, evolutionally evolved capacity of human brains, and of course brains of other animals, to very, very well see information patterns if information is presented in appropriate analog form, right, visual spatial form. Now, what I want to point out, right, so because as you can see, both science and kind of theory are going to be sort of lurking in and out, right, through this timeline. Okay, so we have this new scientist, so there is more data, right? Scientists, trying to develop techniques to deal with data. We develop a new field of scientific visualization, and as time progresses, right, we have new kinds of science, right, or new kinds of scientific fields, or new kinds of scientific methodologies. We're dealing with very large, right, historically unprecedented data sets is becoming more and more part of scientific enterprise. And of course, later in the 90s, in this decade, business, government as well, right? Web analytics, and so forth. Meanwhile, one of the interesting things which happens in cultural criticism is in fact the opposite movement, right? Where partly, right, through, let's say, certain interpretations of ideas of deconstruction, and our developments, let's say, in the universities, at least the American universities, because at that point, like I didn't really have a global perspective because I was here when I was a graduate student, right? But let's say I go to my PhD program between 1998 and 1993, right? And we go in particular classes where we may spend an hour analyzing one line, right, over literary text, or perhaps a single frame, right, from a film. Think about Roland Barthes, articles such as Third Image, right? So Roland Barthes never actually writes about a film; he writes about stills of a film, right? And of course, that was very important. That was very interesting. But what's more interesting in that aspect is that science and cultural theory are always moving in opposite directions, right? One is microscopic, one is telescopic. Big data, small data. Okay, so the next development, which of course everybody here also know, because some of the maybe sort of most interesting work by students in this area have been done here, right? Let's say approximately 10 years ago, some of the most talented young digital artists and designers start looking at this new area of visualization. And I would say during this 10 years, visualization slowly turns from purely functional kind of tool, right, used mostly by scientists, to a significant presence in contemporary culture. We now find visualizations in some of the most prestigious newly built cultural spaces. And it's basically emerging as a new artistic form, which I think eventually will become maybe as important as, let's say, photography or film were to the 20th century. Because in the age of huge information growth, in the age of information flows, in the age where most significant processes don't leave visible traces, right? Communication flowing from electronic networks around the world, right? Bits are flowing between your graphical card and your hard drive and your monitor, monetary flows, and so on and so forth. You can't capture these things in film and photography, right? So that's why I think certain new visual technologies and techniques, which are about information design, information diagramming, and information visualization, are becoming more and more important. Okay, so again, you know all these references, but maybe you don't know every single one of them. So simply, kind of take you a few examples of where we are with information as a cultural form today, right? And before we go over, again, I'm sure everybody has seen it, but those of you who haven't seen it, this is just, right, few examples of a kind of use of visualization in science, right? So this, let's say, was the norm until recently. So when we're looking at this, let's say, more artistic or design work in InfoVis, right, we always have to remember about the kind of normal discourse, right? So this is the typical sort of stuff, right? Bird flu, animation. This is a still of a simulation, right? Mathematical model of 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So you see how earthquake spreads over in time and space. Viruses in 3D, and et cetera, right? Ocean, water patterns, global warming, et cetera, right? So now, suddenly, literally within the last 2 years, right, information visualization, which I think most people in culture haven't really heard of, within the last 2 years, suddenly it explodes, and it's now at MoMA and Seattle Public Library and Volkswagen Autostadt. It's amazing, right? So of course, you know about MoMA's Design Elastic Mind exhibition, which features both artistic work and visualization, and also some work created by people from, let's say, San Diego Supercomputer Center. There have been a number of articles in Business Week about, let's say, some of the more prominent people doing information visualization, let's say, in the commercial sphere, such as Lisa Strassfield from Pentagram, or Martin Württemberg from IBM, right? And we'll look at his history flow later. Here's another article from Metropolis, right, a design magazine about Jonathan Harris, right? So there's this media coverage. Okay. Now you know about sort of kind of web portals, right, which are collecting more and more interesting, let's say, artistic projects or design projects in this media, or perhaps projects which are at the intersection of information visualization and other cultural discourses. So information visualization, which in fact the title was sort of inspired by my book, right? And I kind of feel sad I haven't finished the book right in 2000 because now I have to go look at every single example, right, before I can finish my book, right? But there's tons of stuff here, right? So we have 165 locative visualizations. We have 69 clothing visualizations, so on and so forth, right? So this is another portal like with visual complexity. So I don't know if you look at statistics, but very interesting. So if you look at statistics, right, you can see how basically we have a kind of from about 98, right, which I told you things really get started, we have practically an exponential growth of, let's say, interesting projects in this area, particularly visualization of complexity. And then in architecture, right, the new, let's say, probably the most interesting, most significant new building in New York, built in decades, the IEC building by Frank Gehry, right, on the 18th Street in New York. And as you know, we have a big video wall in the lobby, and because of a semi-transparent treatment of the walls, you know, if you're kind of here on the highway, right, you can kind of see inside and see this, what we claim is one of the largest continuous screens. And when you actually go inside the building, I couldn't take pictures because, of course, they didn't let me. But, you know, we basically we cycle through a number of different visual shows, you know, every 4 hours. And one of the shows is visualization of web users accessing and interacting with the different websites which this IEC company, right, of IEC company, and we own various web properties, you know, Ticketmaster, Us.com, and other kind of commercially successful websites. And in fact, you don't see it here, but there is a kind of, you know, there is a kind of lobby, you know, right behind here in the corner, you know, where now we're seeing a menu. And what we have there is we have a kind of big screen like this, and there is a large Google Earth type of virtual globe, and there is a sort of real-time visualization of how many people are right now accessing, you know, Ticketmaster and, you know, what cities they're coming from. So this is actually very interesting by itself. I mean, I'm just showing you one example of each, right, of a kind of different genres or different types of buildings, because what I'm also seeing more and more is dynamic visualization emerges as a new logo, right, as a new logo of a company institution, right? So rather than representing itself, or perhaps as a supplement to more traditional logo and logotype, right? So rather than representing itself through some kind of static symbol, some static icon, institutions are choosing more and more, right? There are more and more examples to represent themselves by dynamic info-based representation of, let's say, dynamic processes. Okay? Like another example of it, which I'm not going to show, is that if you go to New MoMA, and once again, you know, behind the counter, you know, where you buy tickets, you have a number of screens, and we show dynamic visualization, right, time-based visualization created by Imaginary Forces, you know, which is a company in LA, which was one of the first motion graphics companies, right, started by Cooper. And basically visualization, I'm not going to show it because it takes a while for it to load. So I'm going to lose my own flow here. But it's basically visualization of like a whole MoMA collection of paintings, what we call the kind of barcode of MoMA, and it goes from a kind of thin stripes where each painting is compressed into a single line of color to seeing the whole painting, and we have this kind of dynamic visualization which can represent MoMA, right? Another interesting example, and again, this is simply to demonstrate how like there is this kind of singularity reached in the development of InfoVis, how around 2006 or so suddenly it's been very rapidly accepted, right, as a new kind of public medium. So where before you would get painting or sculpture, you now have a dynamic visualization which in some cases actually gives you some insight into the processes, or perhaps it's a new artistic form, right? Because we can also think of information visualization as not just functional, useful. We can think of it in different ways. We can think of it as a strong commentary on a particular aspects of reality, right? And the artist or designer chose to do this commentary through this new medium information visualization. So we choose a particular metaphors, you know, colors, design, and so on, right? And we choose of a data set becomes a way in which you make commentary, right? A statement, an artistic or semantic statement, you know, about the subject matter. A way, for example, if you're doing a photograph, you make a statement by choosing what you're going to photograph. your lens, your composition, and so on and so forth, right? We can also think of information visualization as a new development in the history of abstract form, right? The history of form were morphogenesis of forms, a new history, a new chapter in the history of 20th century abstraction, but this is new types of abstract forms which are directly derived from data, right? Directly derived from data. And finally, there's also a whole body of information visualization projects by people like Ben Fry and others, where some data simply acts as one of the inputs, right? And then the artist kind of creates self-sufficient virtual world, self-sufficient aesthetic world, but there is some connection between this world and some kind of data set, right? So there's a lot of different roles now visualization is playing. So this is another example. This is by Shift Control Studios from Berlin. So this is, Autostad by Volkswagen. As you know, in Germany, all these car companies are competing. We all have like Zaha Hadid and UN Studio and other star architects building this kind of car deliveries, car museum centers. With Autostad, which just opened, I think, in the fall, basically, this is not the actual pictures of the galleries and the lobbies. This is just a mock-up visualization. But basically, Volkswagen have chosen to represent its history, its identity, right? Not through photographs, videos, interviews, etc., good workers, etc., right? Good bosses, but through a number of information visualization displayed on 16 iMac screens, right? This is just some mock-ups of some of the screens, right? Okay, more examples, right? So this is, again, you probably know, this is George Lagradi, who was one of the 3 artists commissioned to do a permanent installation for the Seattle Public Library, a celebrated building because it was built by OMA, right, Office of Rem Koolhaas. And what George, or rather his students, who of course work on the projects, this is like how it looked. So one thing, it's kind of curious that all these institutions have chosen to put InfoVis like behind the counter, right, as a part of a lobby. So it's not quite a public sculpture in the lobby, right? So there's actually something interesting going on. Okay, so basically, we're simply looking at the kind of library catalog, right, the database, and looking at the ISBN numbers of books, and then mapping these numbers into the Dewey classification system, right? So these books are from literature, these books are from zoology, and so on and so forth. And you have this kind of dynamic information flow, which shows you kind of as books go in and out of the library. It's animated, but here we just have some stills. Another one, that's also very interesting. So this is one of the probably the latest project by Mark Hansen, right, who teaches here in statistics department, and his collaborator, the composer and digital artist Ben Rubin. And this one is for a New York Times building. So in this case, it's a few hundred screens, which basically kind of visualize, right, contents from both today's paper and from New York Times website. Right? Yeah, actually, I actually don't know. I haven't been in this building. Do you know it was installed, or it's like a work in progress, or anybody knows? It's done, right? Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay. So now, just very briefly, a few examples of student works, including work of your own student. Right. Alex Koblin, right? And then some work of our students. It's not a competition, but okay. So this is Alex Dragalevsky, who got his MFA a couple of years ago, working with me and other people. Now he's a PhD student at, under Judith Donov, right, in a group at MIT. So part of his MFA show was this project called STEM Architecture, where he collected he made a database of like over 50,000 STEM messages, right? And then he, using my scripting, I think, he translated them into this kind of virtual three-dimensional sculptures, right? And of course, it's a very interesting work, particularly if you discuss it with students or art students, because obviously we can put it in the context of 20th century art and the whole tradition of artists from Mertz, right, and photo montage and photo collage onward, right, working with a kind of refuge, the noise, the informal, the refuse, right? Think about, for example, I mean, it's not completely connected, but we can make connection to a formless show of in Pompidou by Yvalan Dubois, Bois and Rosenkraus, right? The equivalent, the opposite of a form, right? It's kind of formless tradition in modern art. And once again, right, so obviously there's kind of also this tradition of in modern art, this concept that something which society thinks is a waste, right, something in fact you don't want, right, the artist turned it into something valuable and kind of artistic experience, right. So that's one example. And then this is actually just projects done by undergraduate students. In my class, this is like a few students over a few weeks, right? So it's not a very big scale project. So this is, we basically found, we found websites where we have texts, lyrics of like most popular songs for every year. So we analyze this data. So here we have, 40s, 50s, 60s. And the project was done using many eyes, right? The software from Martin Württemberg, where you can make information visualization without any programming. And then we simply kind of show you what are the most popular words and these lyrics in each decade, by size. And you find out that after 80, like love becomes smaller, and then after 90, the songs got really kind of quite pessimistic. So in fact, if you work more with data, I'm sure you can find kind of more interesting things. And then was actually another project also, which is maybe more interesting even. Okay. Yeah, here we go. So what we did is we basically asked like a few dozen people, their friends, undergraduate students at UCSD, to give them a list of different objects we owe and different songs we like and movies we like. Basically, whatever cultural brands, right, which are part of your, let's say, kind of media consumer identity. And then again, using many eyes, we created a number of visualizations where in this case, the people appear on the periphery, and then these cultural brands, right, the cultural objects are in the center, right? And again, it's an undergraduate project done like these people never worked in this media, but I think there's something interesting going on here. I mean, I like the fact that both people and the brands, the cultural objects are represented in exactly the same way. So perhaps ironically or playfully, we can say that this is a visual representation of a Brun Latour, right, actor network theory, but maybe we don't want to go there. But what's more interesting even is that when we kind of went to Wikipedia and we got this list of subcultures. And I said, guys, this is very, very theoretically problematic. You realize that, right? Because, for example, if your friend owns, PlayStation, you can't say that your friend, belongs to some kind of, Japanese game subculture. If your friend, owns Adidas, that he belongs to Afro-American, basketball subculture, right? I mean, things are not so simple, but I said, go do it anyway, because we have to start somewhere, right? So we try to kind of draw these circles which represent these different sort of identities and the idea that each person is a set of attributes, a set of features, right, coming from these different subcultures, right? So, of course, what's nice about many eyes, I'll just show you a few more examples. What's nice about many eyes as a way to teach things. So this is focusing on, like, I don't know, rocker, and then, let's see, some more stuff here. Yeah, okay. Somewhere here. There's another one here somewhere. Okay, hold on. There's one I liked. Oh, yeah. I like this one, casual subculture. Right? Okay, so even if it's completely wrong, it's a great start, and maybe it's not, right? What's nice about using many eyes for teaching, right, is that, so it's a portal created by the lab, right, run by Martin Württemberg at IBM, and it's a kind of, right, it's a new attempt to further popularize information visualization as a medium. So anybody can put a data set, and then the students can come and sort of, you can put a web data set, visualize it, or you can go and visualize somebody else's data set, right? So if students are creating data sets and visualization one quarter, when you can take next quarter, you can say, let's, with students' permission, let's look at the data sets done last quarter, and let's see if we can further work with them. Okay. Oh my God, things are going really slow. Okay, now I have to speed up, right? What time did we start? We started 12:45? Few minutes. Okay, let's try to go. Okay, perfect. Okay, let's go quickly then, no problem. Okay, so what else happens? Okay, 2000s, another data explosion, right? In 2007, a new study has confirmed, basically has estimated when in 2008, there's going to be more information generated in this, in this 1 year than in the whole history of humanity up until this year. And this number is going to grow every year, right? Okay, and you can look at articles in many scientific fields, from linguistics to astronomy to life sciences to genomics, business and so on. And a typical article would say, we're drowning in data, we have too much data, how can we extract knowledge from this data, how can we monetize it, et cetera, right? So everybody is dealing with this problem, but people in culture are largely not aware of it, right? So for them, it's not an issue yet. So what else is happening? Well, in parallel to this data explosion, we have, again, in the last 10 years or so, massive digitization of existing cultural assets, right? We have ArtStore, which is a Mellon-funded project where we went to different slide libraries of different universities, including CSD. So we now have a high-quality, with good metadata, over 700,000 images from the whole history of art. Amazing data archive just sitting there, right? And the way people use it, like slides. You select your slide, you show them to the students using, 19th century or 20th or 18th century interface, right? Or a kind of index of images, right? A grid of images. It's like, that's all we can do with 700,000 images in digital form of metadata. You're kidding me, right? We have Google Books, for example, right? I think we're digitizing, as far as I know, about 3,000 books a day. 3,000 a day, approximately. Now, and then about 4 years ago, right, we have another interesting cultural information bomb, right? Flickr, YouTube, and of course, other websites in other countries, which in fact existed before, right? Somebody said that these American sites were copied from websites already in Asia. For example, Chinese equivalent of YouTube went online about 4 months before American YouTube, H5 and Cyworld, but it doesn't matter who was first, right? So exponential growth of cultural information and people's communication around cultural objects, cultural conversations, right? Film reviews and blogs, comments on Flickr photographs produced by non-professionals. So statistics are kind of amazing, but I'm sure 10 years from now it's going to be more amazing. In the middle of last summer, Flickr had about 600 million images. 6 months later, it grew to 1.2 billion. So it's about, 100 million per month. It means that in about a week, people upload more photographs on Flickr than probably all images, all cultural art, objects, and images in all museums in the world, right? And you can say, Lev, but I was drunk at the party, somebody took a picture, it's me and my girlfriend vacationing in Orlando, in Disney World. Yeah, but who knows what's important? This is a big theoretical question, right? I mean, you go to museum and there's some pot, right? Some pottery from 3,000 years ago, which I'm sure was very trivial, right? And now it's an important cultural artifact and source of knowledge, right? So what else, right? So what I'm saying is that in the last 10 years, there are a number of parallel kind of information bombs of different scales, right? So there's a big one in society in general. Then there is another one, which is digitization of existing cultural assets, right? There's another one, which is social media user-generated content. But I think the one which is the most interesting, because it hasn't been noticed, is it's a much smaller curve, right? But the shape is the same, right? Similar growth of global culture industries, right? Professional educational institutions, actors, and cultural projects, right? Because of globalization and because of a phenomenon which I call not a flat world, but the inverted world, where so-called peripheries, newly developed countries are in fact moving much faster and more daring and sometimes investing more in education culture than all developed countries, right? You go to China, there's like 300 departments of digital art and design. Well, you don't know if it's digital art design or something else, but there are 300 departments, and they're doing work, right? And sometimes it's And sometimes it's as bad as the worst students of ours, sometimes it's as good as the best students of ours, right? Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. So I will show you, I know I'm running out of time, but I will show you just a few websites which I think are really relevant here. So for example, ColorFloat, right? Anybody can submit their design portfolio. We have over like 90,000 portfolios. It varies every day. And then, if you basically start looking at statistics, it's really kind of very interesting picture, right? It's a very interesting picture. And what's interesting is, if you look at these portfolios, it's very hard to say, is this person coming from London, Philippines, Mongolia, Poland? But it would be actually interesting to ask this question, right? So here's Philippines, United States, India, right, et cetera, et cetera. And my bet, if you do statistical analysis of where the people who are putting designs on this website are coming from, you're probably going to get lots of America because English language website in UK, and then you're probably going to get a lot of sort of China, India, sort of Middle East, and not so much Europe, right? And this kind of reflects the cultural dynamics of this particular kind of years. So it's ColorFloat, right, which gives you an amazing picture of kind of this expansion of global kind of design culture, by which I mean it doesn't mean that everybody's speaking the same language, but everybody has access to the same information, and everybody has the same tools, and everybody kind of wants to compete in the same global cultural marketplace, right? So that's what I mean by global culture, right? So there's design, which is a very nice kind of what I would call not a channel, but super channel, where people filter like most, let's say, interesting visible work in architecture. And of course, if you start looking for it, it's going to be Dubai, China, India, where things really happen, right? Whereas, for example, Archinect, which gives you an amazing snapshot of what's happening around the world in terms of student work in architecture. So this is an image gallery which shows you student works in architecture. Okay? And then there's the same thing for example, motion graphics. Okay? But as I said, surprisingly, while this kind of explosion of a number of cultural producers, right, students, professionals, a number of projects, portfolios, architectural designs, and so on and so forth, a number of cultural institutions, right, museums, schools, galleries, is also growing, right? I don't know if it's growing exponentially, but it's growing very quickly. To me, this is a completely new cultural situation, okay? And I don't think theoretically we actually started to address it yet. So if you put all these different points, right, which I put on the map, and if you connect them together, I think what I'm going to propose now, and that's kind of conclusion, is in fact, I think, a kind of logical outcome if you triangulate all these points. And what are these points? Let's review, right? We have exponential growth of information. We have emergence of information visualization as a new way to deal with it. Information visualization is now becomes an acceptable part of culture. So people are now beginning to kind of accept it, although often it's not presented as an interactive tool, but as a kind of beautiful display. We have a similar exponential explosion in terms of, let's say, user-generated content, global user-generated content. And we have another explosion in terms of professional kind of culture around the world. So if me and Erkki want to have a conversation, about interactive media, we can't, because both, me and him have seen 0.00001%, right? If me and Kate Hales want to have a conversation about contemporary literature, we can have a conversation, but we'll be painfully aware that we only know, right? I mean, I know nothing, but you know more, but it's still going to be 0.0%, right? And so what do we do, right? What do we do? Well, here's what I propose. Okay, Erkki, 5 more minutes, right? Sure. Yeah, okay. So here it is. So this is the idea I've been kind of nurturing since 2005. And then about a year ago, I gave it a name: Cultural Analytics, Analysis and Visualization of Large Cultural Data Sets. So my basic idea, I think, should be obvious by now. Let's use this amazing cultural sort of archives or databases which have been created, Google Books, the whole human art history on art store, design portals such as Colorfloat, and of course, there are lots of others which I didn't mention. And of course, we can go and collect our own information, right? Because maybe people, let's say in India, like in the poor part of India, who are sharing, the whole family is sharing one mobile phone. Okay, we're creating some cultural content, so to speak, but maybe we're not putting it exactly on Facebook. And let's say you go to Mexico City and there are these amazing, unbelievable shanty towns, where from like zero, from within 30 years, people themselves create a whole town, right, without any companies, the minimum motivation of government. So we also want to kind of see what's happening in these places. We don't simply want to limit ourselves to the culture which left digital traces, right? But these already existing digital archives kind of show us, the direction, right? So let's take these archives and let's see if we can start applying information visualization, sometimes by itself, sometimes combined with statistical analysis, combined with new interfaces which would allow us to make sense of these millions of images, these millions kind of culture data points, maybe even data mining, right? Like the whole arsenal of methods and techniques already used in all areas of society except of culture, combined with our traditional theoretical, right, methods, hermeneutics, close readings, right? We don't want to throw this away, to see if we can start creating tools which I hope one day, maybe soon, right, would become kind of everyday tools for everybody who deals with culture. Whether you are a young artist, an educator, a person going to a museum, a trend forecasting agency, right? A kind of tools which would allow us to see new patterns, question our ideas about culture, and perhaps keep track of the kind of global cultural flows. So, in contrast to most, not all, but to most existing information visualizations done by artists and designers, which often start with not with some, I think, really kind of important theoretical or conceptual questions, but rather with whatever data is available, right? So we have API to Flickr. Let's visualize Flickr images. We have API to Amazon. Well, no, I want to start with what I think are really important questions, such as, can we create quantitative measures of cultural innovation? Can we have a real-time detailed map of global cultural production and consumption, remixing, sharing, etc., etc.? Can we visualize flows of cultural ideas, images, and trends? Can we visually represent how cultural and lifestyle preferences gradually change over time, and so on and so forth, right? So just kind of show you a few other questions I would like to address here. Okay, just a second. Maybe. Okay. So, for example, what about visualizing cultural change, right? I mean, most of our theory in the last 40 years has been deeply influenced by the theory of history, which postulates basically breaks, right? Thomas Kuhn epistemes, or Thomas Kuhn paradigms or Foucault epistemes. And I don't think in the 20th century, theorists and intellectuals have spent as much time thinking and theorizing how one thing becomes another thing. Well, what if we start introducing simple graphs, charts, and more complex visualizations which show us how things change over time? Maybe we're not going to reveal new patterns, but maybe we'll force people to start thinking more about cultural change, which I think is an important question as the world undergoes cultural globalization, right? The proliferation of styles in popular and dance music, changes in the characteristics of video games, movies, blogs, design, any other popular cultural forms over time. And this is like the last one is my undergraduate students are now trying to do this project, right? Visualizing the changes in development of new intellectual concepts, new cultural concepts in the last 6 years, using Wikipedia pages, right? Comparing, this is kind of, I came up with this little idea. We don't know what's going to work. So basically I said, okay, Lev, what are the new intellectual cultural concepts which emerged in this decade? Serious games, information design, motion graphics. What's the history? Well, if we will have a way to go to Wikipedia, right, and to figure out what these pages are, then you can look, right, because wiki technology, you can look at the origins of these pages, you can look at the history, and you can make some kind of time-space map which will show you development of new cultural concepts, right? At least, because I think when people create entries for these things in Wikipedia, it's probably a pretty good indication when this concept reaches certain critical mass, right? So comparing how frequently different articles get updated over time, tracking developments of new articles, and so on and so forth. So finally, Okay, let me just see if there's something very, very important. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Let me just show you one last thing, and then I make my epilogue. So, can you do it? Well, of course you can do it, right? I mean, the company is already doing it, right? So here's a blog post from Nielsen, and if you're GM or Ford, right, you pay them, and they're going to analyze all the blog traffic, right, in real time, and tell you in real time what are people saying about your different brands, what complaints you make about your company, and you already have artists, at least one artist, Golan Levin, who made this pretty interesting project called Dumpster, where his friend who was working for one of his companies making this web analytics gave him software, and he analyzed the whole blogosphere and selected 100,000 blogs, which software told him, I think with 80% or 90% probability that this blog entry is about breakups, and then he visualized this information. And and this is basically, so of course, if you're a company, right, or if you have access to the software, you can do much more, but this is the example of a demo, right, which we give for free just to show you what we can do. So this is a real-time analysis of basically about 78 million blogs, right, including 725,000 blog posts indexed in the last 24 hours. And it kind of shows you proportion of blogs on different topics, right? Mostly there are diaries, and then there are movies and memes. I don't know what you mean by memes, but it's interesting. Turns out most of my diaries probably coming from Japan, right, which has more blogs than any other language. So it can be done. But let me show you sort of one more thing here, which is, this is Dumpster, by Golan Levin. Okay. All right. Okay, it takes a while for it to load, but. So it's using the same technology, but to kind of data mine people's blog and make this interactive projects about sort of romantic breakups. Of course, only artists would think to make project about people dumping each other for like the Valentine's Day, right? Yeah. So this is Clodalicious. So for example, you can basically put any URL, and it will show you how many people have been taking this URL and using what tags on Delicious, right? So, and then there are articles where people actually have analyzed it and said, can we actually use this as a way to analyze kind of cultural patterns and things like that, right? Okay. See, it doesn't want to do it. Yeah, so here we go, right? Okay, maybe not so interesting, but when you start comparing these things, it does get interesting. Okay, other models we can use as Map of Science, right? So people have analyzed like 700 scientific articles and extracted like 700 paradigms. And then we show you like, which intellectual paradigms are connected to each other. Can we do the same thing for design, for art, for culture? Can we identify, let's say, 700 or, I don't know, cultural DNAs and see how they combined in a global creativity today? Well, I don't know, but I think it could be an interesting way. It can be an interesting way to start doing theory, perhaps in a kind of new way, right? Not kind of top-down structuralism, but a kind of bottom-up structuralism, right? And then, of course, you have projects like History Flows, right, which I think is a good example of what I would call cultural analytics. So this is, again, Martin Württemberg. So this shows you the history of people offering a single web page. And of course, we chose more controversial pages, such as Islam. So the time goes horizontally. And then this is a contribution of different people. So it's of course amazing, interesting image of a collective authorship, collective intelligence. So as article develops over time, obviously it gets longer, and you show here somebody came and deleted everything, and then somebody restored it, right? And then they added new stuff. So the contributions of different people are in different colors, et cetera, et cetera. So of course, we would want these tools to be used, by students, educators, So you would want them to run on iPhones and iPods and mobile phones. On the other hand, if I didn't have access to the projects such as the one I'll show you, I would probably never think about doing something like this. So this is a project done at Colite2, both at Irvine and San Diego. We're using kind of off-the-shelf hardware, right? So you go to Fry's and you buy, simple PCs or Macintoshes, and when you create new system architecture, we're building, basically, according to them at least, the highest resolution displays in the history of displays, right? So the new one, which we have in San Diego, is basically 200 megapixels, right? It's something like 11 by 22 or, I don't know, 9 by 11 30-inch screens running in full resolution, right? So if you're going to have this kind of global map, right? If you're going to have this global map of global cultural flows, I mean, right? You would kind of like to put it here, even you can actually study this sort of information. So just 1 second. Where's my pictures? Oh, this one. So this is without pictures. So so now you think, okay. So now we kind of now we kind of postscript, right? So I was telling about this idea, like to more and more people, and everybody said, it's a great idea, but let somebody fund it yet, right? So it's kind of, I don't know if you're right, but it's an interesting idea. Well, guys, as of last week, it's no longer my idea. It's my official funding policy of NIH, right? So here's an article from April 22. A supercomputer takes humanities scholars into the 21st century, and Brett Bobley, director of NIH Office for Digital Humanities, says, finding patterns in the data is exactly what high-performance computing is good at, but the tools are generally unfamiliar in the world of art and letters, right? So NIH Digital Humanities Project wants to kind of drag the scholars in the 21st century, right? So it's kind of a revolution which is going to come from above, right? Obviously we want to like suck up, right, to NSF and make some alliances, but I think also people who are running this office understand, right? I think they're kind of thinking the same things as me, that maybe this is one of, not only, but maybe this is one of the directions where kind of theory and analysis of culture and even thinking about cultural strategies, maybe this is where it should go, right? So I'm going to show you this kind of page, right? So we call it Humanities High Performance Computing Resource page. And here it is, right? Currently, only a small number of humanities scholars are taking advantage of high performance computing, but just as scientists have, over time, begun to tap enormous potentials of high performance computing, the humanities are beginning as well. Humanities scholars often deal with large sets of unstructured data. They might take form of historical newspapers, books, election data, archaeological fragments, audio and video. So, of course, we're not quite ready to say things like video games, industrial design, product design, space design, media art, but obviously what I'm interested in is developing these tools, which would go along with my own kind of more traditional theoretical attempts, right, to analyze digital culture, right, what I'm doing in my books. But the idea basically is the same, right? We want to offer humanities opportunities to sort through mind and better understand and visualize this data. Okay. Finally, postscript, 2 quotes. So one quote comes from one of the kind of research groups, university research group, which is working on data mining. The next decade will produce a revolution in the use of archived, simulation, and near real-time data to guide future decisions and research directions. So our society has already become data mining society. So we also need to think about this theoretically, and we also need to learn how to use these tools ourselves. So why be passive victims of Nielsen, block pulse, and other industrial tools? And the last quote maybe is a little bit coy, but I'll put it here anyway. This is from David Patterson, manager of Online Encyclopedia of Life, online reference of 1 million known plant and animal species. It's from actually 2008, this quote, right? Sorry. Okay. As we switch from small collectives of data into very large amounts of information, the kinds of questions we can ask change from parochial question. By parochial, I would say, well, who are people who like to ask parochial questions? Well, sometimes humanities scholars are very good at that, right? To global questions. And the global questions, I think, are increasingly in urgent need of attention. We need to understand how our identities, our dreams, the cultural products which we create and analyze, right, are fitting, right, in a world of not just of 3 or 4 important cities, but you know, thousands of important cities, right? Not just of 3 or 4 important art and design schools, but thousands of art and design schools, right? A world where there is a new cultural situation, right? Where, in fact, it's not only flat world, right? The title of a book from 2000, but I would call this an inverted world, right? A world where periphery is often moving faster than the so-called center. Guys, sorry I took a little bit longer, but thank you so much. I hope we have some time for questions.
Okay, Lev, thank you very much for the speech. I think it was a good idea to sort of like round it out. We're a little bit out of time, I guess, but I guess we could take just a few reactions or questions if you have any points. So, Ramesh, I'll give you the microphone.
Lev, thank you for the talk. I was surprised to not hear much about the subjectivities around what we consider data and information. When we talk, that last quote, which argues that the parochial and global are separable, makes absolutely no sense to me, because people produce data and people produce information in the context of their lived lives, their lived discourses, their local kinds of notions of what knowledge is. And how could we ever even begin to consider what global information flows are without considering the context around which people produce and create information? So if you can talk to me about that,
Sure.
I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. Maybe I should put some kind of, try to put some kind of picture of something, something like, you know, this kind of stuff which I was proposing, which I think, you know, we want to critique, right? Let me just see. I'm not sure why. Okay, just 1 second. I'm not sure why it's happening here. Okay. So I had some pictures here, but something happened to. Okay, maybe it was just not loading. Just 1 second. Just 1 second. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yes, sure. Like this one, I would like to have this one, but you know, if not, maybe. But how about this one, right? But if not this one, well, at least this one, right? Oh, sorry. At least. How about at least this one? Okay, get started. Well, if not this one, you know, we can do this one. Okay. So first of all, right? I mean, it's obviously one of the central questions. Right? What I wanted to do is kind of set up a kind of historical and conceptual landscape, and then simply kind of situate, right, my proposal, right, in this landscape. So to answer your question, I think would require a separate talk, but let me say one thing, right? So this is, by the way, one of this, right, interesting visualization by Lee Byron of his kind of listening habits, right, using Last.fm. And maybe this is something, I don't know, maybe this is something more global. This is AT&T Control Center, right? Well, I think to me, one of the unique things about digital media, and as I kind of found out in my research, and I'll be talking about it more in the, you know, Understanding Metamedia book, is some of the most important properties of digital media, ones which theoretically haven't been discussed yet, like Engelbart's idea of view control, is this kind of implementation of Ames power of 10, right? The fact that you can very quickly zoom out, right, to kind of virtual world, right, Google Earth view and beyond, and then zoom in, right, into the kind of nano, micro, you know, into kind of pixels of our subjectivity, right? So I think that in discussing this tool, you know, I didn't go into any details, right, how the systems are going to look, and I think this is the next step. But I think that definitely what is missing from, I think, the current generation, right, of this, let's say, already emerging visualizations of, let's say, cultural data, cultural flows, cultural patterns, is that we only give you like one level, right? We only give you like, you know, 100-kilometer view, 200-kilometer view. We don't really allow you, right, this kind of movement, okay? And I think this is basically a challenge, which this is both theoretical and a practical challenge, right? That's number one. Number two is that, you know, what I didn't talk about is, let's say, a related interest of mine, which is adopting kind of methods and concepts from GIS field, right, Geographic Information System, and bringing them into culture, both cultural production and cultural research, specifically the idea of layers, right? Because many of you know the difference between traditional mapping and GIS is that you don't have a single map, you have a stack of layers, right? So for example, you can produce a map of UCLA campus, which may have thousands of layers, which will show you what was here before, demographic patterns, linguistic patterns, how the students, what we're studying, what we're talking about on blogs. So I'm very much interested in exploring this as a kind of new way to map new type of kind of artwork, new type of culture, new type of cultural research, and I would like to see this kind of cultural information system, so to speak, to mix, let's say, so-called objective information with some kind of subjective information, coming from, say, people's blogs or diaries, et cetera, et cetera. So I know very well that this is very, very far, right, from theoretically and addressing your question, but definitely at least maybe that will be ways to start, right? So basically bring this into the system and also somehow design the system in such a way so that we immediately tell the user, look, this is not complete information, this is not complete culture. This is, 29%, and this is what else is going on in this place, which is unmappable, right? But how do you map unmappable, right? How do you represent unrepresentable? This is also an interesting question, right? So as opposed to just giving it up and saying, well, whatever beyond the web doesn't exist, right? So for example, when I was in Mexico City a few weeks ago, and this architect took me inside these shanty towns where somebody comes like in 1970 and puts his first house because he saved $100 to buy concrete, and then 30 years later you have a whole community. Well, this guy says, we need to learn from these developments. So this is also kind of things we need to map.
Right? Yeah, Lev, coming to this image, because you have it here on the screen, most of us remember that event, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago when the one space shuttle with the teacher on board exploded. And yes, while that thing was already in the air, like a firecracker breaking in millions of pieces, one guy at that control center figured out, actually, while it was on that screen in all detail, obviously we have a major malfunction, he said in the microphone, right? What was kind of funny because, and that shows that nobody would ever pay attention to these kind of boards, to these visualizations of information, as they are, to my knowledge, in place for only one reason, and that is for the reason of making the appropriate wallpaper for this kind of business. Yeah, so how boring would a shot into the control room of AT&T look like if that thing would not be on the wall, right? You have just a few people sitting like in a tax accountant office behind computer screens and pushing buttons, right? Okay. So I don't really buy into this this sort of architectural scheme farther than for the use of wallpaper. What's your take on it? Okay.
Well, what about things like Google Analytics, right? I mean, do people use it also as a wallpaper, or is it something which people actually seems like in lots of areas of contemporary society, at least finance, at least professional kind of website management, and dozens of other areas. I mean, people use this daily, and right? I mean, right? So I put this wallpaper again as a way to say, well, we can go very big, but it doesn't have to be, right? Hopefully it's not going to be wallpaper. And what I also want to say is that, again, you know what I do, right? I never say, let's go where, right? I'm simply watching trends, right? I'm doing my own cultural analytics in my head, and when I see that there is a certain energy or a certain developments, right, going in a particular direction, I try to write about it, and I said, well, how can we get very further, right? So let me show you something, right? This is not wallpaper. Maybe I'm confusing oranges and apples, but it's something, right? So this is Obama. So this is Obama, right? Obama website. And those of you who haven't done there, those of you who haven't been there, let's see. First of all, I think it's the best use of social media, right? Because his team is amazing, and it's we're everywhere, right? LinkedIn, Eventful, Asian Eve, Eons, I don't know, Faith-based, Facebook. So he's everywhere, right? But now if you go to Results Center, you're going to see very simple, very elegant InfoVis. Okay. Now, you can say that he's not using it as a research tool, he's using it as a rhetorical tool, but I'm sure that people who are managing his campaign are using these tools as research tools as well, right? So I think that you're absolutely right? That both in the case of MoMA, let's say lobby, and maybe in TNT, although we'll have to find out, right? There are many cases where it is used purely rhetorically, but I do think that, let's put it this way. Yes, of course, Bruno Latour made this very powerful argument that part of scientific competition today, who can make the best image. But I would say, and of course, when I work with a scientist, yes, sometimes I wonder, right, how functional are these information visualizations? Do we simply satisfy their kind of artistic suppressed desires? But it would be surprising to me if, like, the whole huge field of scientific visualization was purely wallpaper, right? Somehow it doesn't make sense, right? So I think that it is one use of it, but I would say actually wallpaper would be also good, right? Even just to have this new displays of culture, you go to a museum, right, or you go to an art history lecture, and you get to see, even if it's static images, it already gives people a different way to think about, let's say, kind of culture and history flows. When Remkulis was asked to design the LACMA, which when we didn't do it, right? He wanted to reconfigure the whole art history. He wanted to have a set of parallel galleries connected sort of perpendicular to basically flatten out the whole art history and to make people see connections, right? So these things are already happening in terms of exhibitions, right? Like where people, instead of doing historical timeline or periods, we try to mix things up. So I think that even this kind of static images can be also effective, right? Yeah.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Lev, can I ask just give me a brief answer to this question. So if you think about your sort of like thinking in general,
yes,
not just in this project but also in the language of new media. So the Russian formalist legacy. Mm-hmm. So the structural linguistics of the 20s and 30s, mm-hmm. and you spoke about Vladimir Prop and Roman Jakobson, right, and these people. They are obviously a very sort of like important foundation for your thinking. So you didn't really elaborate too much actually in this talk, sure. But I'm just kind of like curious. Okay, this is a very kind of broad question, right. So that if when we apply sort of like an approach like that you are sketching for us here for the sort of like analysis of cultural data sets, does it in a certain sense mean a return to a certain kind of structuralist approach to culture?
Okay. So it's a question which I was thinking about, and when I, let's say, write up like a big white paper, I definitely want to have a big juicy section to talk about it. So here's how I think about it right now, right? Okay. So, and again, I would actually have to like do some research and actually look more specifically at Prop and Levi-Strauss. But here's my thinking, right? Okay, so Prop looked at, I don't know, a few hundred or I don't know how many folk tales. And Levi-Strauss looked at, I don't know, a few thousand myths without any computers, right? And simply using their kind of brains, right? Their brain data mining machines. He said, okay, I see 28 narrative functions. And I see, and then the kind of 60s more extreme, right, structuralism. Eventually it all got reduced into the semiotic rectangle of 4 functions, right? Okay, so you have this basically, so what you have is you have a typical project which is native of 20th century science of reductivism, right? Like you're basically reducing the empirical, you're reducing lots of individual elements to a small number of functions, features, attributes, narratives of narrative formals, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what I'm proposing is exactly the opposite, right? In other words, okay, what if we actually analyze more systematically, right? Much larger data sets, and actually see, what are different features were, which maybe we didn't even expect. And let's say, even if we have these features of functions, what is their statistical distribution? Like, what is the long tail? Look at them almost as a long tail. And most importantly, I mean, one of the interesting things which I think can come out from this approach is we can perhaps find lots of different dimensions, right? Dimensions or features in contemporary or past culture for which we don't have names, right? But ultimately, I think methodologically, it's obviously informed by this history, but in some ways, it's a complete opposite. And I think this is also, for example, this is what happened to linguistics, like we couldn't solve voice recognition problem for decades. And now, like right now, you call everybody, you have a voice recognition, it works, because we have a statistical analysis, right? We simply analyze millions and millions of sentences, and then when you call, the computer can basically say, okay, 82%, this is what the person is saying, right? So this is also in some ways the next stage in development of this kind of linguistic thinking as well to a certain extent. So I think it's kind of, in some ways, it's a complete opposite, right?
Okay, I think this is all. Thank you, Lev, and thanks for the audience. And so also for our remote participants, so please come back tomorrow at 12:30. There's another lecture in this theory series by Franz